Hi guys, this is Nadia from Imbali Crafts, and today I want to show you how to create a little flower mandala. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe and bell button to get notifications of new updates. I quite often make kits and tutorials for the videos on here, so if you want, click on the shop link below and see if there's anything that grabs your fancy. Also, if you want to share your makes and join an awesome artist community on Facebook, and I'll pop the link below. Right, so let's get started. Now for this I have used a little schematic. You can also get this on my website if you want, or else you can draw something similar on a piece of paper or just do it freehand. Now I've used 1mm just to show you the technique. Obviously you'd use the correct gauge, which is your 1.6mm 14 gauge wire. And the reason for that is that we want to hammer it later, obviously, and the thicker the wire, the more sturdy the piece, and obviously you get more surface area when you are hammering. So that was the reason for the really heavy gauge. So what I'm doing here is I'm just following the schematic, and that will also make sure that everything is at least sort of symmetrical. It'll never be 100%, obviously, but at least it will give you a great shape. So if you can, draw it on a piece of paper, or else do it freehand. It's whatever works for you, works basically. So we're going to follow the shape until you have come full circle. I quite often lift it off the paper to adjust. Otherwise you can just follow the lines using your pliers. It'll be a little bit harder with the thicker gauges, but you'll take your time at home. So once we've done that, that's what it looks like. And this is now obviously with the thicker gauge. And what we're going to do is trim one end off. You'll need your heavy duty cutters for this, because obviously you don't want to ruin your good pair. So cutting off the one side, and we're just curling in the one end and tuck it away. I'm not going to use that again. So just take your time and roll it in. So obviously the heavy gauge will fight you a little bit. So that's what it looks like. And next, so what we're going to do is, we've got a bit of remaining wire, and I've just used that to create a little coil at the back, just to hide all the ugly bits at the back. It's easy to do. So we cut a piece off. So I've left about, I think this is about 8 centimeters. I didn't actually measure it, but you can sort of do it by eye. So what we're going to do now is squeeze the end of the wire. I do this quite a lot because it kind of thins out the ends, and it creates a nice little smooth curve and a thin fine end, which looks not much nicer than the sort of blunt cuts that you get. So I'm rolling it in. So again, obviously thicker gauge will fight you a little bit. So here I'm using a pair of bent nose pliers. I find them quite useful sometimes if I want to reach sort of tucked away areas, or like in this case, do some curls. So I'm trying to kind of grab onto the way. I can see how difficult the sort of thicker gauge can be. So just take your time with that. And then once you've got a little bit of an area, it's much easier. You've got something to hold on to, and then the coil happens much easier. Okay. There we go. I've got something to grab onto. Now finally it's rolling into place. So you need to roll it until it's kind of central, and then we kind of adjust it to sit over all the sort of bases of the petals, and that will just hide everything. You can tie it down later, because obviously you don't want it to grab on anything and get bent out of shape. So that's what it looks like so far. That's the front. Next, I'm just going to grab a piece of wire, and what I'm doing here is just a simple figure of 8 weave to bind the leaves together. Really is just around each petal side once, full circle, and then I'm going across to the other side. I think I undid a section here, so going through full circle, and then I'm crossing over to the other side, go through the middle of the petal, one full revolution, and that's what it looks like. And this just serves the purpose of binding the two leaves together. So next is a fun bit. We're going to hammer the leaves. Now obviously I am going from the back, so the difference here is I've got a dome chasing hammer. You get different types, and this one has a dome, and this means it'll leave less markings. When you have a hammer with a flat face, you quite often get sort of straight marks across the wire. When you have a dome one, this prevents it. So I'm adjusting as I'm going, and when I'm hammering, I always sort of hit the wire into the direction that I want the metal to expand to. So direct your blow outwards in this case, because we want the metal to flare. And obviously remember that there will be markings on the side that you hammer on, so decide whether you want texture on the front or you want texture on the back. So in this case, I decided that I wanted texture at the back because I wanted a nice smooth finish at the top. So just going to continue until we've done them all. So that's all the petals done, and you can see I've only expanded them at the tip, and I'm hitting them quite hard now, always in the direction that I want the metal to expand. And you can see the little markings of where I've hit, and it's actually quite nice once you oxidize it and polish it, because it gives sort of a rustic look. So the front is quite smooth, obviously, because that was the side that was pressed against the metal when we hammered. So we're going to then take a file and shape out any irregularities around the edges, because obviously we want everything to be as polished as possible. So with the file, and you've got a little needle file for the inside if you have one, we're just going to remove any rough edges with a jeweler's file. That's what it looks like so far. So next I'm going to use a pair of bail making pliers. If you don't have any of those, you can use other normal pliers. You'll just have to you know, be a bit more careful with the shaping so you don't put any bends in it as opposed to rolls, but these work quite well. So you kind of roll the wire against the bigger barrel and shape them, and this kind of gives a sort of more raised 3D look. That's what it looks like. So here I've created a little gallery setting. I'll pop a link for this tutorial below the video. I didn't want to add it here because it would make the video much longer, so I'll pop a link below. So we're going to create one with a 10mm stone. You can use bigger or smaller stones obviously as well, so just make it fit to your design size. So just going to pick a side that you like as the top, because obviously you're not going to be 100% symmetrical. So pick a nice side, and we place the stone in the center, and we're going to use one leg on each side, and we're just going to attach it to a petal, and that's just really to center the stone and attach it. Now you could just cut those wires off completely and attach the stone with weaving wire to the frame if you wanted to. That would eliminate those legs, so it's entirely up to you. This is just the way I've done it. So we're going to just wrap it once or twice, just enough to secure it. And I haven't actually cut these off right until the end of the tutorial, because I always kind of design on the fly, so I'll usually add in, so I never cut my wires off. So they'll be hanging around as an octopus for a little while. So I'm going to go one more wrap, other side as well, and just enough, as I said, to secure the stone to the center. That's what it looks like. You could use these as little tendrils or something like that later on if you wanted to. Right, so what I'm going to do next is, obviously the one side is still a little loose, so I'm picking up another piece of wire, and all I'm doing here is wherever I can find a way through the weaves of the frame and the stone, and I'm securing the stone to the base frame with a couple of wraps as well. So next we're going to create the smaller flower. Again, there's a little schematic. The length of each of these petals is roughly about 1 centimeter. So you kind of shape. It's a bit like the gallery setting. So if you have a look at the tutorial for the gallery setting, it's pretty much the same principle. So we are folding these wire sections as we go. So I'm always trying to create an equal gap and an equal size. So if you have a look here, if you use a certain pair of pliers, use the same one every single time and use the same place on the pair of pliers to create the gap. So I'm kind of folding it outwards. And I make sure every time I create a new bend, I make sure that the base wires are completely 90 degrees before I create a new prong. That way you can ensure that they are the same size. So I'm kind of folding over the bend, and I always make sure that I leave a little bit at the top before I create the bend to leave room for the metal thickness to complete the curve. I hope that makes sense. And then I'm always referencing back again, obviously, to make sure it's the same size. So I've created a few prongs here. It turned out later I needed to add a couple of more. I think the total was about 11, so I made 11 prongs. So we're going to do next, again, your bell making pliers or any other object that is small enough to fit round objects. We're going to place it right inside the petal near the tip. And what we're going to do is we just gently fold the wire around the petal itself. A little bit fiddly at this stage. So grab hold of it and fold the two ends together, and that way you make sure that each petal is symmetrical because you're folding the wires around the object to meet at the bottom, which means the same amount of wires used on each side, which makes it perfectly symmetrical. Okay, so fold it. And that's the full circle done. So you obviously have to just reference it back against your stone occasionally. Now this was an earlier piece that I've made which has less petals, but I'll explain in a minute. So we're closing this. So closing this off, and what all I'm doing here is I take one leg on from one side and I wrap it around a petal on the opposing side. So just one wrap is enough because all we're doing here is closing it off. So I'm grabbing the other side as well, and it's a little bit long, so it's much easier to work with if you have a smaller section. Cutting all these wires off. And all I'm doing here now is closing the loop around, and what this will do, the wires on each side will kind of hug the wires or the petals on the opposing side, thus creating a sort of closure of sorts. And you kind of try and want to keep the gap the same as in between all of the petals. Now this is what happens if you squeeze too hard on the wires. So the wires become brittle and then they break, unfortunately, the tips. So you need to be very careful when you're bending the wires at the top so that you don't you don't damage the wire, so it doesn't weaken it. So there's about 11 petals, sorry, for the flower, and I'm just double checking that it fits. They're a little bit large, and the nice thing with this design is that you can open or close the design to make it suit your stone, because it's almost like I don't remember what you call this tool, and harmonica or something like that, where you pull them apart. So you can either make the circle smaller or bigger, depending on how you adjust the gap between the petals. So double checking, and now it fits a little bit better. So you kind of want to slot it in place so it kind of slides over the stone and stays put. Next, going to hammer the tip again. So be careful here again. If you have in any way damaged the tip, this is where you would get a breakage. So hammer the tips out ever so slightly. You can do this obviously whichever way you like. You can see here the domed side of the hammer, which is great. I'm using the ball side of the hammer to get the tips because obviously they're quite fine, and I'm hammering just the ends so that they're flared out ever so slightly. That's what it looks like. So next we want to create a little bit of depth. So again, I'm using a pair of bell making pliers. As I said, you can just use runner's pliers if you don't have this kind of pair of pliers. And all we're doing is we start off ever so slightly with each petal, and I'm giving it a slight bend, and I'm working my way around the whole flower. And then I'm just going to continue going around in circles until I'm satisfied with the depth and the way the petals are projecting. So I'm just bending this upwards. And if I reach the end and I'm not satisfied, I'm just going to bend them up ever so slightly more. That's what it looks like. A little bit of 3D. And I'm going to double check this against the stone. So it looks quite nice. Slots in place beautifully as well. So next, before we add any beads, what I suggest we do is polish your frame. Obviously you want to get 100% polished finish in order to have a beautiful shine look. Now I would also oxidize at this point because before we add the beads, it's much better to oxidize beforehand. I do this all the time, but actually with this piece I oxidized after and polished it out. It takes a bit more time, but it actually looks okay. So I'm taking a piece of heavy gauge wire, not heavy gauge, but 0.4 or 0.5 mil, which is your 26 or 25 gauge. And the reason being is we want the wires that hold the beads to be fairly strong. If you use your 28 gauge, it'll just snap eventually. So you want to make sure that this piece stays put. So use a heavier gauge if you can. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a shell pearl in each leaf and a 4mm, I think bead. This is 4 or 5, not really sure. Bead to the inside just to bridge the gap, because obviously you would then have a piece of wire running across without any, so may as well add detail to it. To hide the naked wire, basically. And I always place the bead, so I'm wrapping from over the top so that the wire runs behind the petal, basically, like so. So we're just going to continue around until we've done them all. So now we're getting to the last bead. Now with the last wire, obviously we want to prevent it from opening. So what I do here is the most secure way to get rid of that wire is to wrap it around the first bead, the cross wire, basically wrapping it around itself. What that will do is create a tiny little coil wrap around the wire, which will be very unlikely to become undone. And once you've done that, just pull it tight and this will kind of slot itself in place. We're going to do the same with the other end of the wire, obviously. So we're just going to bring it around the outside and we've slotted in place, and that is definitely tight and won't come undone. So next we're going to do the same for the smallest mandala flower. So we're going to use the same size of copper beads again, and this time we're only placing the beads on the inside. So the way I do this, I put my bead on the wire and I pull the wire from the top to go underneath it, and then I'm going to go around each petal once. Now there's no need for anything in between the petals because they're close enough. So I'm coming back in from the other side and I'm wrapping around the petal, and I come up through the petal like so, and I'm adding a bead so that the bead basically sits on top of the flower rather than underneath, like we did with the big flower. All right, so that's the smaller one done. So we're going to slot that one in place, and the next step is to grab a piece of 4mm wire, and we're going to lash the top flower to this bottom flower. And just the way you do this is basically try and stay as close to the center as possible and make it as tidy as possible, and around each petal the tighter the better so that it stays in place. So just going to feed in and out. You kind of weave the smaller frame to the bigger frame all around the flower and secure it nicely. So that's what that looks like. So we're going to trim off a couple of the wires. As I said, I don't often trim off until I'm completely done, so my work often looks like an octopus. But we're not going to use these wires, so I'm trimming them off. So next, for a little bit of detail and to hide some more ugly sins, we're going to create some micro-facets. So you can use whatever you want. You can use seed beads, small stones, you know, some more wire or something like that, whatever you like. And I'm creating a ring to go around the central stone. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the wire off the ring itself. And again, like I did with the small petal, what we're going to do is stitch it in place. So we're going to go in and out. So I'm going to weave from the front to the back, and I'm coming back up as close to the frame as possible from the inside, and you'll have to go every 2 or 3 beads or so where we stitch it in place to make sure that it's neat and tidy. It would probably have been better if I had used a more contrasting color, so you can actually you know, decide if you wanted to have a different color, something else. The micro-facets I think are actually really nice for this because they add a lot of sparkle to the piece, unless obviously you don't like sparkle, so you can use something else, maybe some more copper beads or so. So you can see how I'm attaching it to the frame. So I'm coming back in from the inside and I'm going to go around the wire to the back, and this is basically stitches it all the way around to the frame. And the last step is to obviously cut off those wires. You could actually use them to add some more detail if you wanted to. I just cut them off. And yeah, that's that. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like, you can follow my social media. I've got Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, you name it. I always post some tutorial updates and some of my other artwork. So if you'd like to see what I get up to, it's all under Imbali Crafts. And as I said earlier in the video, if you'd like to be part of our community, I'll pop a link of our Facebook group below. We're an awesome bunch. We always have fun challenges going, and there's always support for everyone if you have any questions. And as always, if you have any need for kits, wire, or tutorials, just pop over to my website and see if there's anything that you fancy. And that's it. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.